Gaming Act, Mr. Speaker, on the Gaming Control Act and Part 3. While this whole act, Mr. Speaker, this government, the Financial Measures Act, has sort of become a centerpiece following the passage of the budget, and it's their last kick at the can, essentially, to get things in order before going to the polls. And this enabling legislation does that, Mr. Speaker. But more specifically, under Part 3 on the Gaming Control Act, this has been very controversial, particularly in the HRM, Halifax Regional Municipal Unit, and also in the Cape Breton District, in that it really enables this section amendments to the Gaming Control Act, allows the provincial government to override what has been very deliberately and very courageously been a real move to ban smoking in public places. This actually overrides the Municipal Act. And this government and this Minister of Finance misspoke himself, in my opinion, and opinion of others, and better legal minds than mine, that he misspoke himself, speaking of material breach, and already very carelessly gave the casinos some ammunition to support their demands to be exempt from smoking legislation. Now you can talk about all of the exemptions and all of that, but if you look at the contract, Mr. Speaker, and I haven't had, I've glanced through it, but I haven't had the opportunity to read it more carefully today, but I shall. But I cannot see the word smoking jumping off the page. But all of a sudden, it has become the real main issue behind all of this is that, it's got to do with we must override our own municipal unit here in this area where this legislature is situated, that have been trying, and not without its problems, to push forward timely legislation, anti-smoking legislation to ban smoking in public places. So it doesn't specifically, there can be many of bylaws that could be overrode by this government, by this provincial government, override the bylaws of the municipal units, which, as we know, Mr. Speaker, are creatures, so-called creatures of the province. So they depend very much on the benevolence of this government. And this government has chosen to slap them down, to say, no, you're being bad children. We will have the strongest legislation in Canada against smoking. Well, that they were among several provinces that had some substantive legislation at that time, but they're quickly falling behind. And what they're gaining ahead now, right across this country, is the exemptions that they're bringing in on their Public Smoking Act. And that's what the hallmark of this province will be, Mr. Speaker, will be the exemptions that they're bringing in. So the contract doesn't spell out smoking, Mr. Speaker, and the danger of these amendments that will open up the door to other bylaws. It could be to do with parking. It could be do with access to the site. There could be any number of things. It could be signage down the road. It could be any number of things that would open this new widening amendments. Will grant the operators of the casino to maybe drive a truck through this legislation by opening it up. And I know that caught your attention, Mr. Speaker, because I know you have great affinity for going down the road on the 18-wheelers, and we wouldn't go there today, but with respect. I always appreciate that must have been a great experience that you brought to the legislature. But we don't want legislation that we can drive a truck through. And, Mr. Speaker, so there's danger by opening up this whole issue of just leave it alone. get a muzzle on the Minister of Finance, and then go to work on building a case. And I would suggest probably getting some other legal opinions other than the in-house type of advice that this government has used as an excuse. But I think in all fairness, and this really spells out what this act, these amendments on this enabling legislation does, Mr. Speaker, that it really, the government thinks that they can bring in items like this, open up to other challenges by the casino operators that would challenge other bylaws of HRM, and they think they can blame that on the previous government. Well, that's not going to wash, Mr. Speaker. This government has been government for 4 years. Times have changed. The courts have spoken on many issues relative to smoking. The whole landscape on the anti-smoking legislation has changed, Mr. Speaker. And that is, it's not only on a logistic basis that has changed, on a judicial basis, it has changed within the temper of the times. And this government is missing an opportunity, and it's missing an opportunity by ducking the tough issues. And if you look what's happening, the Band-Aid approach to their healthcare system, the education system, and all the others, that they're able to just put this all together, and they're trying to put these things all together and calling them a plan. And it's not washing, Mr. Speaker, and it's not credible within this House, and it's not credible throughout this province. So the first thing is to stop the misspeaking of the ministers of the front bench, and particularly the finance minister, and allowing more ammunition to tip the hand, to show the hand of this government that what it's prepared to go, not only what it's prepared to do, but what it's prepared not to do. And it's not prepared to go to the wall and fight for those workplace issues that would protect people from secondhand smoke. The bottom line is the government is giving in to the casino's demands without a fight. And the minister has given away his position and the position of the government. You know, with negotiating skills, it's no wonder this government lost to Newfoundland and Laurentian boundaries dispute. The member from Glace Bay said he was concerned for a period of time that decision might even take away part of his Glace Bay riding. So he asked, no wonder that the offshore is at a standstill. So this bill also, Mr. Speaker, clearly and distinctly raised the white flag of surrender, that this government was not prepared to stand up for the workers of this province, those people that have to work in situations such as the casino. It's not going to wash to blame it on another government. I was part of that government. And yes, and mind you, when we got to be the final year of minority government, then of course you couldn't get any support for this type of legislation at all. And they were quite happy as our government, to let us take the blame for all of these things. But when their turn came to bat, they simply, after 4 years to get their house in order, have just simply not stepped up to the plate. They've walked away. And that's going to cost lives. That's going to cost Nova Scotians their lives, Mr. Speaker. And it's not only that, it's overriding a municipal unit that's trying their darndest to wrestle, and some people like our nominated candidate in the Sackville area, that he's prepared to put his future on the line and stand up for something that he believes in. And that's...
Hi, Jim. That's because John's going to get nominated.
So when we look back at all of this, Mr. Speaker, it's got shades of the nurses bill that it came to browbeating the nurses. This government had no problem with that, and it comes to the same thing when it's should be protecting the health of Nova Scotians. It shows contempt for those people. It's a symptom, Mr. Speaker, of a much larger problem. It means the government is putting politics before its sound policy. We've seen it throughout this Bill 36, and the reason that we need more consultation and need a 6-month hoist to address some of the issues, that politics, it's riddled with the politics. The $155 check to buy the votes of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, and this backing down from the casinos and tipping your hand and showing the white flag immediately. But when it comes between a choice between good policy and politics, politics with this government, Mr. Speaker, wins every time under this Tory government. And we all know that the deadly consequences when politics is allowed to rule the day, and especially when it comes to occupational health and safety, when secondhand smoke or even in a coal mine. But before I leave that particular part, Section 3 of the Act, and the reason that needs a lot more consultation, that I want to pay tribute to Dr. Andrew Link and the doctors in Cape Breton. Of all the places in this province with its strong history of heavy smoking and environmental issues, that this group, this area has really tried to do something about that and turn their health, turn a chapter and make some changes in health promotion and lifestyle issues. And they've done that well. The aldermen have responded to advice from the health community. They've responded to the people in their constituency, and they have shown leadership. And now, after having a complete ban on smoking in public places, showing leadership in this province, from an area, in all fairness, that most of us thought we would never live long enough to see that day, they really jumped right into the fray and showed leadership. So we have, I just said hoist, yeah. My colleague has reminded me to say hoist every so often, and I certainly, we are
Order, please. The honourable member should adhere to the sage advice of his honourable colleague.
Well, the honourable member does know that he's a very sage colleague and well advised to listen to that. So, but the reason I mention hoist at this juncture, Mr. Speaker, particularly is that these people, the health professionals in the Cape Breton area, have specifically addressed the issue that they have not had proper consultation in that area. They worked so hard, and those are the people that came to this area and spoke on the anti-smoking legislation and to the Law Amendments Committee, and spoke extremely well at that time. And they say there's only so much, Mr. Speaker, that healthcare workers can do to battle the province's very high rate of cancers and heart disease, particularly in the Cape Breton community, and that they do need the leadership and the leadership of this government, and to take that role of leadership on this particular issue. They are dismayed. They cannot believe that of all the battles that they've won and over a period of time can be just done away with by a stroke of the pen here in the Halifax, in the provincial legislature. So it's not a question of not supporting the legislation, which this government has traditionally done. What it's done, it's overriding the legislation, and that's even worse, Mr. Speaker. So this is so important to spend the next while. Let the Premier and others go into the Cape Breton area and see what they feel about overriding their bylaws. The people in that area are very proud, and they know that the battles are won inch by inch. And they fought hard over the years for social justice in that community. And now they're fighting for the lives of people that have to work in communities. And this government is responding after after putting up the white flag, immediately saying to the casino operators, we surrender, you've got us, that bad Liberal government signed a bad contract. Well, that contract, Mr. Speaker, did not speak about smoking. There's not a word about smoking in that contract, and that's the truth. So let this government stand up and be counted, and to act responsible, and adhere to the commitment they made to protect the people of Nova Scotia. Sydney doctors say, Mr. Speaker, the province should stand up and should not be pushed around and intimidated by big tobacco companies and the casino operators. And make no mistake, there's a linkage there. The big tobacco companies are very happy to have the casino operators intimidate this government, and that's exactly what's happening. But Andrew Link, who appeared before the Law Amendments Committee on other legislation relative to these matters, he has said that the medical staff believes the province will not be defeated in the courts or suffer financial penalties by doing the right thing and protecting the Nova Scotians' health. When I was looking for advice when I first came to these chambers back in 1984, and in those earlier years, I looked often to Bill Gillis and Guy Brown and Vince McLean and all the others that were much more experienced. Vince McLean was one of the best and strongest parliamentarians that ever entered these chambers, and he knew the rules, and he adhered to them. And you may make other comments about Vince, and that's up to you. But I certainly felt that he had great respect for the parliamentary tradition, the British parliamentary system. I wish there was a little bit more of it some days here. But anyway, Dr. Link and others feel that, and it's only their opinion, but this government should take the chance, should go toe-to-toe with the casino operators in Sydney and Halifax, and let them prove a disadvantage. See, in fact, what kind of poker they're playing. Will they blink? They believe that they will blink. And if it goes to court, they believe that what's right and fair. And my point about saying advice that I received from people, my older colleagues, more experienced colleagues, and they said, when you're making a point and you're making a speech or you're making a question or a resolution or you bring something before the House, just don't worry about it. Do what you can, speak the truth, speak how you feel. Because if it's right, and it's the right thing to do in the long run, you will be supported and you will be proven to be right. I think this is an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, that this government has had to do the right thing and to be fair with the workers in Nova Scotia. Because you can give away the hard-earned rights just millimeter by millimeter, and that's what's happening here. And it's not right and it's not fair. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that's about all I have to say on relative to the hoist and supporting the hoist on the smoking issue. It's a major issue. I did want to make a few more comments on other matters relative to other parts of this act and as to why there should be a 6-month hoist. And there are some major issues here, and particularly in the tax issues. The overall point about the Part 4 and others, the Income Tax Act relative to that, is the illogic and the way that this government, in the next election, which many people feel will be very shortly, will have to explain to people why they feel that they can buy their vote with their own money. People are starting to understand that this government is increasing the debt in this province, it's borrowing money, and yet at the same time, under the guise of stimulating the economy, is really mailing out checks to buy the votes of Nova Scotians. I spoke earlier on this matter briefly. I haven't spoken a great deal on many of the issues here in this last while, but that I lived in British Columbia. That's the day I confessed to voting NDP, and I'm not going to do that today. Because I've seen the error of my ways for some time now. But I was driven to such a drastic measure by the wacky Bennett government that just had no shame. And I thought I will never see a government like the wacky WAC. I should be more respectful. God rest his soul, WAC Bennett. But I thought I'll never see a government that's so crass and would do anything to get reelected. And everything was going along. And I was very pleased, not that I was ever going to vote NDP again, but the fact, and I don't think this government would drive me to that either, because there's great alternatives with the Danny Graham Liberal Party, potential the next government of this province. But the point being, I never thought I would see the crassness of WAC Bennett ever again in my lifetime. So I was finished with the NDP, I was finished with WAC Bennett, and so I came home to Nova Scotia thinking that there would be no government that would ever in the modern day, in the year 2003, be crass enough to think that they could buy a vote from Nova Scotians with borrowed money. There's something wrong with that picture, Mr. Speaker. There is. Well, you call it a glass turkey or whatever you want to call it. But
And the Liquor Commission started
we do have it here.
the rums of the world.
There's a lot of talk about accounting and how budgets are reported. And there was a movement by our government, the minority government, that the accounting rules would be changed, and we didn't have tangible capital assets accounting like today, and we think it's a good change, and it was supported, and we were certainly moving in that direction. There was a commitment to do that. But just the same, you can amortize every capital project. It doesn't mean you can spend more than you earn. And I think that the big thing here, and the point I want to make at this juncture, Mr. Speaker, is when you look at an act to provide for defraying certain charges and expenses of the public service of the province, and this was tabled, this is bill number 41 before the legislature. And this is why we need to hoist this bill 36, Mr. Speaker, to get out there and let people understand that. Just that one page tells the story of this government. The debt service costs, Department of Finance, $1,062,316,000. The debt servicing costs of this province in this act cited as the Appropriations Act of 2003. And that is more than is the Department of Education. Now we know, and I don't want to dwell on the negatives, because I think there's challenges here in this province. I think, you know, we have a lot of rural areas, and there's a lot of challenge in education, there's a lot of challenge in urban areas. And I'd like to put more of a face in a positive way on education. But we are not doing well nationally in education. I think that's a fair statement. But if you look at what's happening here, the borrowing of this government has placed us with the debt service costs now $1,062,000,000 higher. It's higher than the Department of Education's budget, which is $980,241,000. And then you look down, the other story of this government, that this one page alone that was tabled here, I think, last evening by the Minister of Finance, after he folded up his white flag for waving it at the casino operators, he got out this piece of paper. And it speaks for itself, and it says a lot about this government, Mr. Speaker. You have the Department of Health, $2.1 billion in health. That was more than what we had projected in a health plan that we had devised, and that we were told that was not acceptable by either of the other two parties in a minority government situation. We brought it in during a budget, did not have time to explain it and we had consulted with various groups, various stakeholders, and prior to the release of the budget, but we were, and we had great acceptance into that. But that many people credit was led to the fall of the minority government. At least it was the excuse used at that time. And the Premier, and going into that election, said he could fix health care. Liberals broke it, Tories good, they'll fix it. And 46 million or whatever it was he was going to do it. He wasn't going to be, there'd be no new money. This would all come in from administration, and they were going to cut the fat out of health care. The previous Minister of Health over there is chuckling, but he didn't have great deal of success cutting the fat out of health care, because when he got there, he found out there isn't really any. In fact, he had to bring some more fat in. Well, I shouldn't say that. That might be the wrong description. Although the deputy's chunky, I wouldn't refer to him that way. But they found out to get the quality of people that they needed, that they had to really up the ante and pay a pretty considerable price with travel and expense allowances and salaries. So the Premier said that he could fix health care for $46 million, no new money. Said that $1.5 billion was enough to run the health care system. And now, at this juncture, Mr. Speaker, for health, we see $2.111 million and $454,000. So those two items, Department of Education, now second to the cost for the debt servicing of this province, that those ministers across the way, Mr. Speaker, continually add to. They add, and they've added as much or more to health care than what our proposal won, the very reason that both of the parties used to take a Liberal government down in a minority government situation with very little flexibility, having to kowtow to the wishes and the demands of the other two parties. But we had been forthright with Nova Scotians. We said health care does need an injection. So what has happened here, we've gone from that $1.5 billion to $2.1 billion, a substantive increase, and still no plan. You have an infrastructure where we're seeing resignations of the head of psychiatry for Dalhousie in the Capital Region. We're seeing one of the top oncologists, Dr. Rhino, leaving from here. Here's a gentleman that's came back, recruited by our government during our watch, to come back. He grew up in Herring Cove. He's a local person, an ideal type of person, a very extremely talented oncologist, expert in cancer, and he was recruited through Dr. Andy Padmas to come back here, and now he's leaving. So this is the slippery slope, Mr. Speaker, that you see when you don't put infrastructure in health care to sustain specialists within this province or to family doctors. We see it in psychiatrists. The minister herself has said. And that's why we should hoist this bill, Mr. Speaker, and go out and listen to the people and find out how many more oncologists are, in fact, leaving and how many more psychiatrists are resigning. The Minister of Health said in the House here recently that this province needs 12, I think she said 14 to 15 psychiatrists. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. Now, yes, they have brought forward a plan with adolescent and child psychiatry, and I think a lot of that is a plan that looks like if the personnel can be recruited to fill those slots, Mr. Speaker, that we will have achieved some substantive improvement in the mental health for that particular age group. But we're not doing it for adults, and we're not doing it particularly for seniors, Mr. Speaker. We have in the Yarmouth community 0.5 of a psychiatrist at this juncture, Mr. Speaker. And you talk about a team, a health team. And psychiatrists, not everybody with mental health issues have to go to a psychiatrist. That's a given. There's a lot of family doctors out there that would be pleased to carry on a mental health service to the people in their community, and they would do it well. But they need a couple things, Mr. Speaker. And they need, number one, they need a quick assessment. When you get a young person or an adult sitting in front of you as a family doctor, which I have, and I'm sure others have practiced, have had that experience, that say they're going to kill themselves. Well, some might just go out and do that. And sometimes you can deal with that yourself. as a family doctor. But there's other times you need an assessment, and you need a quick assessment, and you need it then. And you can't let that person out of your sight till you have some other care. You need support. And you need support not only of psychiatry, but you need social workers and health nurses and public health personnel and all matters of support. And that's what's lacking around this province, Mr. Speaker. And that's why, I'm sorry for the minister that she has such a tough job to recruit under those circumstances. But it's this government in the last 4 years that has allowed the infrastructure of health care in this province to deteriorate. It's not increased over the 4 years. You ask the people, Mr. Speaker, look at the waiting times and the lineups and the closures of the cancellation of surgery, the closure of emergency departments on a regular basis. That's why we've got to go out into the communities and hear about those stories. The people want to share those. And I think now, Mr. Speaker, you do have another introduction, I believe.
Thank you. To the Honourable Member for Dartmouth East. Yes, the Member for Annapolis on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to rise in the House today to make an introduction. Young gentleman in the East Galleries always had an extreme interest, I should say, in politics. Mr. Alex Gillis from Middleton, if you'd please stand and receive the warm welcome to the House.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to Mr. Gillis, and welcome to all our guests in the gallery this afternoon as we debate the hoist motion on Bill number 36, the Financial Measures Act. The member for Dartmouth East has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this particular part of addressing the hoist motion, I would just close and refer honourable members to the first page of Bill 41, and that tells an awful lot about this government, Mr. Speaker. There, when the debt service has now markedly exceeded the Department of Education's budget, and the health budget has gone from $1.5 billion that the now Premier said could be completely adequate, that has increased to $2.1 billion, and yet we see the deterioration daily. It gets so you're afraid to open the newspapers or check your emails or speak with your research staff some days as to what next will be happening. And because when people that you've been involved with meeting and encouraging, like Dr. Rhino, to come to this province, who came from that great community of Herring Cove that has bread and buttered so many great Nova Scotian citizens, and you have those people come to your community, recruiting them back from Ontario, and they spend some time here, and then you see them leaving. That is something that strikes right to the heart of health care in this province that is not sustainable, but the job gets more difficult the more often that these types of things happen, where you have good people leaving. The Speaker, speaking to the hoist motion on Bill 36, we talk about missed opportunities. We speak in terms of repeating the mistakes of the past, that burdens that are heavy today on us, that over $1 billion in debt servicing, that the appropriations under the Department of Finance, that really tells the story. And there's no plan in sight to address that particular issue. So while now, Mr. And the other comments I could be making very well, and I'll bring my comments to a close fairly shortly on these matters, but the fact is that I was part of a government, and others of us at that time, we saw the cutbacks from the federal, in the mid-90s, the cutbacks of the federal government. And it's made Canada a much more stable environment and a higher ranking country. But the people of Nova Scotia certainly paid that price. And of course, we paid the ultimate price as a government and not having sustainability in the programs, at least in the minds of the other parties, that was supportable. Because we were forced to do measures that were drastic to maintain, but we did have a plan. We were prepared to put that on the line, and we took our medicine. And the medicine was sour, Mr. Speaker, because it cost us a government. But we were truthful with the people of Nova Scotia. The way that Danny Graham is telling the truth now, Mr. Speaker, about the matters of boring. Well, yeah, so the minister from Preston says, what a joke. But it's fine for you. Do you agree, as a backbencher in this government, that it's proper to go out and borrow money to increase the debt servicing beyond $1 billion? Would you try for $1.5 billion, the honourable member from Preston? When he goes out and, after hoisting this bill and does his consultation, I wonder what the people in his area will say. The people that will get the check will say thank you. What about the people that don't get the check? I think you'll be hearing from them. I believe that. We don't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. The honourable member from Inverness has been fairly good this day, since he's had Friday all to himself. He's been pretty good. I want to compliment him on that. But seriously, Mr. Speaker, we must learn from the past. There's been philosophers and historians have spoken well about this, much better than I might. But this government is falling into the traps, not only of the WAC, Bennett, but of the previous Buchanan government. And that is, the price is there, the figures are waiting, they will move, and they're moving in the wrong direction. So now that we do have a more stable economy nationally, the money's coming from Ottawa. In fact, the new health money this year, and I've never heard it disputed too much, we said there was only, of the $140 million going into health care, the increased money, only about $300,000 was actually new money from the province, and that the federal government was bailing them out. Now, that would have been a scenario that as Minister of Health, I certainly would have enjoyed, and not trying to explain to people why we had to swallow the medicine that the federal government was dishing out in the mid-90s, and really not having the flexibility. But when I look back on telehealth and the EHS services, the new ambulance services, and all the things that our government did under very difficult, challenging times, with cutbacks coming from the federal. When you woke up in the morning, you didn't know what was going to happen next to your budget. But I make no apologies for what we did. And we managed very frugally, and we managed well. And we also were under that burden of the debt that was passed on by the previous Tory government. So we're seeing, why does history have to repeat itself again, Mr. Speaker? That's what we're seeing here today, history repeating itself. The economy is relatively healthy in this time. So why not pay down the debt now and find ways to save some money, that you can put that money, that over $1 billion in debt services, put it into the health care, into public health issues. Look at the scare with SARS. Did we not learn anything from that? How Toronto just floundered for a period of time, and within their own healthcare hospital system is where the system broke down, and we had lost. And one of the editorials in the National Post this morning, the financial page, speaks in terms of politics overriding science, and that's exactly what this bill is doing. This bill is politics is overriding good fiscal management, and politics is overriding the good healthcare management within this province. And instead of using that $68 million or even the tax rebate of $140 million, then we're continuing to borrow and taking away from that, building that infrastructure within healthcare that is so important. So the money is coming in from Ottawa now. I certainly envy those, and I might even say a bit jealous at times, that they're able to live under these times when the federal government has opened the coffers in so many areas. Going to announcements of $66 million, the Minister of Community Services announcing all federal money and there, without a federal minister taking any credit for it at all, allowing the provincial government to show on the evening news as if that was their largesse. Well, their largesse, Mr. Speaker, when you look at the total picture, and this balance sheet is really costing us markedly, even though the federal government is coming up to bat. And this government has not come up to bat, has not come up to bat for the people of Nova Scotia, the children of Nova Scotia, the needs of education, and the matters of literacy, shelter, personal safety, all those rights that are enshrined in the rights of the child, Convention on the Rights of the Child, that are being neglected by this government as they move forward with a political agenda within the revenues management of this province and within the education and within the healthcare system. It's all about politics. And it amazes me that the people on the opposite side of this house can find this funny and a joke that they can mail out $155 checks thinking that they can buy the vote of Nova Scotians. I hope it doesn't work. I have lots of faith in this province. I love this province. I chose this province to live in after having been away for a few years, and I haven't regretted a minute of it, ever. But I have faith in the people that they will see through what's actually happening, and that they, by taking that check, and even if it is need, if they are in great need, $155 is a lot of money to many people. I still feel like I'm rich if I got $50 in my back pocket, but so be it, Mr. Speaker. I expect that having filed an income tax, I will have to accept that check. We won't get into details what we do with that. But the times are relatively better now. This government has had a better ride than our previous government. So, but are we working our way, how well, if there is a downturn, a recession, Mr. Speaker, if interest rates go up, how well are we going to be placed on the balance sheet, Mr. Speaker, when we have over $1 billion a year in this province of less than 1 million people that we have debt service charges? What if that goes up with high interest rates and there is a recession and a downturn? We just can't see. Who would have thought of 9/11 and the impact that had? Who would think of SARS and the impact it had in a city such as Toronto, who now for many years may well be labeled, Mr. Speaker, because perhaps there was a breakdown in the public health system. And that's what happens when your infrastructure breaks down, Mr. Speaker. You are not prepared and you don't respond, and you're fighting a rearguard action. And that's what happened. That's what we're doing here in adult mental health. That's what we're doing in education, Mr. Speaker, because 33% is not a good enough results for the children of this province in matters relative to their literacy and their future job training and access into the world economy. So it took us a decade to recover from the last recession, and we're still paying for that, as the balance sheet shows. It's not an accident that the debt service costs are $1 billion. It happened, Mr. Speaker, because 13 years ago, it was decided it was okay to spend instead of paying off the debts. In the 80s, it was, don't worry, Sable will save us, the offshore. We can spend now because the economy will grow later. Well, we know that hasn't happened, Mr. Speaker, but the government kept insisting onward and upward. And there was a bit of a plan that government had. They had some capable people there. They should have done better because they did have capable people. But are you going to use an excuse that this government doesn't have capable people? Some people have that opinion. Arrogance tends to cover up incompetence often, and maybe is that what we're seeing coming into this election? Some people say that. I don't want to misspoke myself here in the House, Mr. Speaker, because we've already lost one member today, and the ranks are getting a little shallow in spots. So I'm very careful when I speak to the hoist motion for Bill 36, that I'm very careful to stick right directly to the hoist part of this amendment. So one member said I should hoist myself, and I think he wants to speak, so I'm going to give him the opportunity pretty quickly. Mr. Speaker, so what what it is here, we have a government that really doesn't care about the future. It's all about now. It's like an addiction. It's like they've got addicted to gambling, they've got addicted to smoke, and they've got addicted to the free checks in the mail. But there's no free checks in the mail, Mr. Speaker. The day of reckoning is upon us, and it will come, and it'll face us right head on. So this government is a government that doesn't care about the future. It cares about the election that may well be very close, within maybe a few days even. Who knows when it'll be called. But they're not concerned about the welfare and the well-being, particularly of our children. People say, well, the children are our future. That's only half a sentence, Mr. Speaker. The children are our future, but the rest of that sentence is, and their needs are now, and they can't wait. They can't wait in education. They can't wait in health protection or in child protection. They can't in early child development, prenatal, all of those matters. The children, the welfare, the social well-being of our children cannot wait because their needs are now. The growing debt, it threatens a whole generation. And this government, Mr. Speaker, is saying, don't worry, be happy. It's soon time to get the barbecue message from the Premier again. Don't go out around, be happy. The only thing is they got to get that election over with before the students come back in September, so they better not get too happy out there and get careless. But I'm sure they're doing polling and they're trying to balance it off whether they can, what's going to happen. Maybe 6 months will change their mind. Maybe they'll try to stretch it to 5 years. They could, but at least they're not doing the 2- and 3-year John Buchanan trick, but they've hung in long enough trying to get up in the polls, so maybe their polling is telling them that they're looking a little stronger. I doubt it. So it loans people $155 a day. It's loaning them money, or the borrowed money. So they're borrowing, loaning the money out. But the people of Nova Scotia will have to pay that $155 back someday, Mr. Speaker. And that's what they want to talk about to this government. See what plans they have for paying that $155 back. You see, Mr. Speaker, debt is just deferred taxation. And you can talk about increasing taxes or decreasing taxes, and debt is deferred taxation. It means the tax breaks of today will mean a tax increase of tomorrow. So you can play all the glossy brochures that we're going to see out from consultants from Toronto that this government usually gets in, and they'll be talking about, oh, well, vote for us. We're going to cut your taxes. We're going to give you more money. We're going to fix health care. We're going to educate your children, and all of those promises. They are not all things to all people. In fact, they're very quickly becoming nothing to everyone, and they're losing credibility rapidly. And thinking Nova Scotians can spot this, Mr. Speaker, and they're going to have to be accountable for that. And sooner or later, it'll be at the ballot box. So borrowing $118 million to give back $68 million is bad math. It's bad public policy, and it's even bad politics, and we should wait and see how that works. I believe that Nova Scotians can't be bought, Mr. Speaker, and I think in supporting the amendment to hoist this Bill 36 for 6 months, you would hear that. So the choice is there. Hoist it for 6 months, or go to the people and let them speak at the ballot box. Either way, I think Nova Scotians are fair-minded, and they want to do what's right. And they will give the information to this Tory government that they can't play politics with the health care system and the education and the health and well-being of their children, whose needs are now, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Speaker, I'm pleased to enter the debate and speak for some time on the hoist motion that was introduced with respect to Bill number 36. The motion is a delay motion. It's a 6-month hoist to give all members of this House an opportunity to discuss their respective thoughts or their constituents' feelings with respect to this legislation. And I have a few things that I wanted to say as well, Mr. Speaker. I think the opportunity to take 6 months and consider the implications of this bill and what in fact it means in the scheme of things, in the scheme of the political debate in the province of Nova Scotia, is a good idea. Mr. Speaker, over the last number of years, last 10 years, this province and other provinces in the country have been engaged in what I think is a phony exercise of trying to present a semblance of fiscal management to the taxpayers. They've done things, as we have here and elsewhere, brought in balanced budget legislation, which restricts and constrains a government in terms of what they can do in terms of increasing the debt or increasing the deficit in any particular year. And what that does is that has an impact on the decisions that are made in any given year by the government. I use, for example, the decision by the Liberals in 1996 to build schools in the province of Nova Scotia through what's called P3s, or public-private partnerships. They did this not because it was a good idea, not because it would save money, not because it would improve education in the province of Nova Scotia. They did it simply so that they could build some schools, Mr. Speaker, that were badly needed in the province, and they could do it. They could pay for the construction of those schools through annual lease payments that were made to the private sector who designed, built, and operate these schools for a period of 20 years. In other words, that was a decision that was made strictly as a result of the accounting rules, as a result of the constraints brought upon the government by balanced budget legislation. And the consequence in that case was that we've got schools that are being operated by the private sector where access is being restricted, the quality is in question in many of those schools. The inequity of education provided between P3 schools and other public schools is increased, or has increased, and of course the cost is much greater, Mr. Speaker, because of the need for profit and the extra and increased costs of borrowing that were faced by the private sector in order to finance these projects over a period of 20 years. So the decision to engage in this shell game of balanced budgets, of trying to present a vision of fiscal management, good fiscal management, it ends up costing this province and ends up costing the taxpayers considerably, Mr. Speaker, over the short and long term. And I think the 6-month hoist, the reason I stand to support it is that would provide us an opportunity to explore some of those issues and some other issues that I'd like to raise. My colleague, the finance critic for the NDP caucus, has pointed out, Mr. Speaker, the member for Halifax Fairview, has pointed out that the supposed surplus that we had in 2002, 2003, and 2002, 2003 is illusory, that it doesn't really exist on paper. He talked about, Mr. Speaker, he talked about federal tax changes that were made, accounting changes that were made in the previous year and made again this year that were changed, resulted in the government being able to register a $14 million surplus for that year. We know, even without that, or beside that, at the end of the 2002-2003 budget year, we had a massive, catastrophic flood in the province of Nova Scotia, which is going to mean at least $10 million plus to the province of Nova Scotia, extra costs, extra expenditures. So even without the accounting work that was done, Mr. Speaker, the obvious cost to the province of Nova Scotia are going to mean that surplus doesn't exist. The surplus for this year, likewise, Mr. Speaker, could very well end up disappearing in a puff of smoke. And again, I think it's questionable exactly, and something that we should discuss, whether in fact we're accomplishing anything as a legislature, or whether this government is accomplishing anything by continuing to play this balanced budget game. And the reason I say that is because on the one hand, we supposedly have a few $1 million in surplus, but on the other hand, we have a debt that is increasing at an alarming rate year after year, Mr. Speaker. And so the servicing costs for that debt are increasing upwards, Mr. Speaker, of $1.5 billion annually. And that's a lot of money, and it indicates that even when it comes to the straight optical showing the numbers on the paper, that we aren't really in a true surplus situation. But there are other consequences to playing this game, Mr. Speaker, that I think should be explored over the 6-month period. And that is what parts of the economy, what parts of the public sector, what parts of the province of Nova Scotia and life in the province of Nova Scotia is suffering as a result of some of these decisions. We just had an Auditor General's report come down a few weeks ago that registered again that there is a capital construction deficit in school boards of an excess of $500 million. What that means, Mr. Speaker, is that in order to bring the 466 schools, and that's what we have in the province of Nova Scotia, in order to bring those schools up to scratch, in order to repair damage as a result of deferred maintenance and otherwise to these schools, it would cost the province $500 million in order to do that. That's in excess of $1 million per school. What that means is that if we continue not to fail to invest to catch up to the deferred maintenance that we've let go in the past, that it's going to continue to build like a snowball. It's going to get worse in the future, Mr. Speaker. So you could say that that $500 million should in fact be added to the debt of the province of Nova Scotia, because it's an obligation. It's a liability on the taxpayers that at some point or other is going to have to be paid. And in the meantime, you've got children who are going to school in schools that are making them sick, in schools that are not adequate, in schools that don't have enough space, in schools that don't have proper facilities, or facilities that are in a proper condition in order for them to realize the same level of education that their cohort does in other parts of the province. So, in other words, Mr. Speaker, the children right now that are attending school in the province of Nova Scotia, that are in one of those schools that is in desperate need of maintenance and repair, are paying for this game that we're playing here in the House of do you or do you not have a surplus, or do you or do you not have a balanced budget. At some point, Mr. Speaker, we are going to be faced with making some investments. In education, surely it needs to be recognized that any money spent in education is an investment in the economy. It's an investment in our society as Nova Scotians. It's an investment in our future. And it should not be looked on as simply a pawn in the game of politics over balanced budgets. We have problems, Mr. Speaker, in other areas of this province that are failing to be invested upon, so that the government can stand up and say, we have a balanced budget, or we have a surplus, therefore we are good managers. You and I know that there are tens of millions of dollars necessary or needed to be able to bring our roads our secondary roads, let alone our 100 series highways, up to some kind of condition. And if those roads, Mr. Speaker, are not brought up to standard, then and our bridges and other transportation, highway transportation infrastructure are not brought up to standard and not brought up to snuff, then what that's doing is that's increasing costs to the economy of this province through accidents, through injuries, through fatalities, through damage to equipment, through the impeding of the movement of goods and services in the province of Nova Scotia. It is an investment that is going to have to be made. It's going to have to be made at some point, and if we continue to defer it, it's only going to build, Mr. Speaker. It's only going to build. So when you think about the millions, the tens and hundreds of millions that are necessary to bring that highway infrastructure up to scratch, Mr. Speaker, can we then truly say that we have a balanced budget or a surplus? Likewise, in areas of water and sewer, of other municipal infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, we have failed over the last number of years to make the investments that are necessary in that level of infrastructure. The consequences are going to be considerable if we fail to recognize the level of deterioration in that infrastructure. I mean, we know that last year we had 30 to 40 boil water orders in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That is municipal, small municipal, and large municipal water supplies, drinking water supplies, Mr. Speaker, that where the quality of the water has gotten to the point where that water needs to be tested. It's not safe for human consumption. Now, part of the reason why this is happening is that we don't have appropriate, let alone adequate, infrastructure in place to treat and to clean the drinking water to ensure that it's safe. That's an investment that is going to have to be made, Mr. Speaker, if not by this government, by some future government. That's an obligation, a liability that the taxpayers of the province of Nova Scotia are going to be responsible for. Let's continue and look at the failure of this government to invest in workplace safety and health, Mr. Speaker. We have regulations still on the desk of the minister, still in the department of the minister, on things like violence, on things like air quality, on things like industrial safety, dealing with chemical and biological hazards, dealing with rollover protection, regulations which, if they were in place, could save lives, could prevent injuries, and could save costs for employers, Mr. Speaker, and for employees. But if these regulations were implemented, then there would need to be resources put behind the implementation of these regulations to ensure that they were enforced. And we already have a problem in the Department of Labor with the lack of inspectors, or inspectors that are desperately overworked, Mr. Speaker, and the result is that workplace safety and health, many feel in this province, is not a priority of this government. So the point I'm making is that by failing to put the proper resources in place, by failing to do simple things like assigning a special prosecutor in the Department of Justice to occupational health and safety issues, is putting off, I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, costs to employees, to workers who end up getting injured, who end up dying on the job, and it puts off costs to individual employers as well. Just look at what this government has done around the smoking issue. They have They have failed to take the leadership that's necessary. They have failed to work together with the municipality here in Halifax, HRM, and in Sydney to properly enforce a no smoking bylaw throughout all workplaces. Mr. Speaker, they have decided to exempt casinos. They have decided, Mr. Speaker, for whatever reason, that the lives of those workers working in that casino that are sucking in that toxic air that's filled with that air that's filled with toxic fumes of secondhand smoke, that they are the ones, as a result, them and their families and the province down the road are going to absorb additional costs rather than the casino or rather than the province of Nova Scotia right now, by properly enforcing the bylaws, backing up their smoking in the workplace, in public places legislation, Mr. Speaker, by providing an exemption for casinos in the province of Nova Scotia, is again shifting the burden, shifting the financial burden onto the backs of workers who will end up getting sick and may die as a result of working in these smoke-filled workplaces. The people outside, the women and men, Mr. Speaker, who work for who work in small options homes here in HRM, provide services to the intellectually disabled, are on the streets, are on a strike. They have withdrawn their labor from RRSS, and they have done so because of the fact that this government has made a decision that it's more important to play the game of pretending that we have a little surplus rather than appropriately and adequately funding small options programs in the province of Nova Scotia. By properly providing services to those Nova Scotians who are requiring the assistance of special workers like the ones that are out there on the streets right now, providing the space in small options homes and the programs and services that will enable these Nova Scotians to learn, to gain confidence, to gain skills, so that they will be able to continue to gain independence, Mr. Speaker, and be able to make a contribution to their communities. The government has made a very clear choice not to properly fund RRSS so that they can provide the beds and services necessary, and so that they can provide a fair wage to their workers. The government has made a choice not to do that, but instead to try to play the game, to try to fool Nova Scotians, to try to fool all of us, probably, to try to fool all of us, Mr. Speaker, into thinking that they have a surplus. It's wrong, and I asked the minister today in this House, Mr. Speaker, how he and his government can allow this dispute to continue. This dispute, Mr. Speaker, is resulting in devastation to some families, is resulting in the disruption to the lives of people that are unable to care for themselves, that are unable to handle the level of disruption and distraction that they are being faced with. They are the ones that are paying the ultimate price here, Mr. Speaker. And I understand this idea that, well, we're not the employer, we're arm's length, we're behind closed doors. But, Mr. Speaker, no one is being fooled. No one is being fooled into believing that it's not the government of Nova Scotia that is the ultimate funder of this service that will determine whether or not the management of RRSS has sufficient funds in order to negotiate. I'm not standing here asking the minister to necessarily hand over gobs of money to settle this dispute. But what I'm asking him and his colleagues to do is to consider the impact that this dispute is having on the clients, on the families, on the workers who have dedicated to their lives to the service of those who are intellectually disabled, and to step in some way, shape, or form to ensure that this dispute is brought to a close. And there are a lot of different ways, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of tools available to the minister and his government and his colleague, the Minister of Labour, in order to solve this dispute. Mr. Speaker, I'm not standing here and arguing on behalf of either side at this point, but I'm saying to this government, it's unconscionable that you're allowing this dispute to continue. You can't wash your hands of it. You have to get involved, and this dispute must be resolved, Mr. Speaker, in the spirit of fairness and compassion for Nova Scotians.
Ask the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, there's been some debate in this House about this $155 and whether it's the most cynical form of political posturing by a government. It's not unlike, in many ways, the $600 million health investments fund that the Liberals proposed in 1999, with absolutely no caveats, with no parameters whatsoever, just saying, you know, we're going to spend $600 million of your money. We don't know how, we don't know where, but we want you to know that we're going to spend it, and we want you to vote for us. It's like buying their vote. That's what the $155 is intended to do, Mr. Speaker. It takes $40 million. It takes $40 million of revenue out of the system and gives it back to individual Nova Scotians. Certain individual Nova Scotians, not all Nova Scotians. And I've spoken to many people who have said to me that, you know, they're going to take that $155 and they're going to spend it and going to say thank you very much. It's not going to have an impact on how they're going to vote. It's their level of respect and cynicism for government and what government can do is so low that they say, well, it's better than nothing. But there are many others who are saying, why don't they take that $155? Why don't they take that $40-odd million and invest it into services for the intellectually disabled? Why don't they invest it into the system to ensure that this dispute is resolved? Why don't they invest it into services for children in schools who require special education? Why don't they invest it into services and support and technical aids for disabled Nova Scotians? Why don't they return some of the money that was ripped out of the pockets of children when the child's tax credit was reduced? Why don't they invest that $40+ million into the healthcare system that is providing such inadequate care to so many Nova Scotians? Those are some of the things that Nova Scotians are saying about the $100 and the $155. But you see, it's all about politics. That's what we're into here. It's all about politics. This government has been very much a stand pat kind of, you know, keep your head down, stay below the radar screen, tread water, hand out a few goodies, and hope that we'll get reelected. And I tell you, Mr. Speaker, that there are many Nova Scotians who voted for this group opposite who are very discouraged and dissatisfied with the lack of leadership that is coming from the other side. Because, majority of Nova Scotians believe that there is reason to have hope, that there is reason to believe that this province will prosper on its own, let alone with a visionary and a proactive government. That there are Nova Scotians by the tens of thousands throughout this province who are working in different ways to make their lives better, to make the lives of their neighbors and their families better, Mr. Speaker. And all they're looking for from the government is a bit of leadership, is a bit of confidence, is a bit of hope, and we're not seeing that because, again, nobody's fooled. Nobody's fooled that at some point in the very near future, in some places it's immediate, the schools have to be replaced. Some people realize that in some places the bridges need to be replaced because they are falling down, that the roads need to be fixed, Mr. Speaker, that there's infrastructure that needs to be responded to by this government. There are investments that need to be made that this government is not making so that they can play the silly game of standing here and saying, look at us, what a great government are we. We've been able to balance the budget or come up with a minuscule surplus. But, Mr. Speaker, who else is paying? There's children, the intellectually disabled, the people who work with, provide support and services to those Nova Scotians, people that work in casinos, the people that work in workplaces and through no fault of their own become injured or whose families suffer as a result of this, Mr. Speaker. They're paying. Seniors on fixed income are continuing to pay more. Their gasoline, home heating fuel continues to go up. Their insurance costs, Mr. Speaker, automobile insurance costs are going right through the roof. And is this government doing anything, Mr. Speaker, to prevent that, to prevent the burden of increased costs onto those Nova Scotians? No, they're not. And you must wonder if they're not doing that because they are reaping significant increases in revenue as a result of the tax on things like insurance premiums, on things like increased fuel costs, Mr. Speaker. And so while individual Nova Scotians, seniors, people on fixed incomes are paying more, are paying extra, they are able to get away another day. They're able to get away with a budget that says that, hey, we have a small surplus. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians, I believe, deserve better than this. Nova Scotians deserve some frankness. They deserve some honesty. They deserve some real proposals to deal with the challenges. They deserve a government that's going to stand up to corporate citizens like those that operate the casinos in the province of Nova Scotia that are trying to bully the government and ultimately bullying their own workers. Mr. Speaker, this province deserves a government that's going to stand up and demand that Nova Scotians get access to our natural gas so that we get appropriate revenues from the natural resources that are being extracted from this province. They're looking for a government that's going to make the kind of investments that will make this a better place, to designate more area of this province as protected areas, as wilderness areas, Mr. Speaker, to ensure, in fact, that there are enough environmental inspectors available to make sure that the environmental catastrophes that are taking part in this province are not allowed to continue. To enforce our Environment Act. What's the point of having an Environment Act, Mr. Speaker? What's the point of the minister having the authority to designate or require that a full environmental assessment will be conducted on particular projects if we don't carry forward with that. If the government doesn't have the commitment, doesn't have the fortitude in order to follow through on the responsibilities that it has, Mr. Speaker. Those are some of the things that Nova Scotians are looking for. Because otherwise, individual Nova Scotians they have to pick up the costs. And in over 6 months, as a result of this hoist, if we agree to pass it, we'll be able to discuss these things. Mr. Speaker, I talked in this House a week or so ago about a family in Herring Cove whose son had an accident and suffered brain injury. He is trying, and they are trying, Mr. Speaker, to work with the Department of Health, working with the Nova Scotia Rehabilitation Centre to regain his skills and abilities, the skills and abilities that he lost as a result of the brain injury, so that he can live independently, so that he can go back to work, so that he can continue as he was to make an important contribution to his community and to this province. But, Mr. Speaker, while on the one hand the Department of Health would offer him a few hours, or his family a few hours of home care, someone to come in and do a little cooking or cleaning, they wouldn't provide financial assistance to help him and his family with a person that would work with him to help him regain some of his skills and ability. His family, his parents, are fully carrying the burden of hiring an individual to work with their son, because the Department of Health does not allow the flexibility to ensure that those who suffer brain injuries in the province of Nova Scotia get appropriate help. And this has been, I've been in this House for 12 years, and for 12 years, at various times over that period, I've been arguing on behalf of constituents who are brain injured and who are not receiving the kind of appropriate services that they should be entitled to in the province of Nova Scotia. So those people, as a result of the fact that those services aren't available, that the government is not investing in those kind of services that should be expected of a humane and mature society like ours in Nova Scotia. Because the government is not investing in those, then individuals are picking up the costs or are suffering the burden of not getting the results of those programs. Just so this government can say we have a surplus. Just can say that, we've balanced the budget. We've maintained the provisions, or stayed within the provisions of our balanced budget legislation. But the point I'm trying to make is that are they really benefiting anybody but themselves, Mr. Speaker? Because ultimately, the economy, our society will pay as a result of the government's failure to make those investments. In some cases, it'll come out of individuals' pockets. In some cases, people's capacity to perform and to contribute will be impacted to the extent that it'll affect our community, it'll affect our economy. And I say to you, Mr. Speaker, I, for one, member of this House, resident of the province of Nova Scotia, I feel that is wrong. I mentioned earlier resources for special education in the school system, Mr. Speaker. We have a policy of inclusion in the province of Nova Scotia in our public schools. And yet there's a desperate lack of resources for those students, for those classrooms where children with special needs are attempting to get an education. And the consequence of the failure of the system to provide proper and adequate supports is that individual with special needs does not get the attention, does not get the assistance, the support, the training that they need, Mr. Speaker. The people that are working in that classroom as it is are suffering as a result of the lack of appropriate and adequate supports. The other children in that classroom are being distracted and disrupted and otherwise affected, Mr. Speaker. And so no one benefits as a result of a policy of inclusion on the one hand, but a failure to make the investment to make that policy properly function, Mr. Speaker. The last estimates of the deficit in funding for special education in our schools is in excess of $20 million. That's just to bring things up to standard. That's just to bring things up to the minimum, Mr. Speaker. So when we fail to make those investments, when we would rather say that we've got a $20 million surplus, rather than provide programs for those people requiring special education in our schools, who wins and who loses there, Mr. Speaker? That's the thing that we have to ask ourselves. What gains are being made? A whole generation of children have had their backs turned by our government, and right now this government, previously the previous government, but any government that fails to make those kind of investments because of some phony argument that's been established, Mr. Speaker, that's been established that says this is how we define proper fiscal management. This is how we're going to define good government. By having a balanced budget law that says from year to year we can't run a deficit. We have to run a surplus on the books, on the basis of these accounting rules that doesn't take into account the $500 million deficit in capital construction in schools, that doesn't take into account the deficit in funding for special education, that doesn't take into account the deficit in funding for the healthcare system, funding for supports for those with intellectual disadvantages, for the disabled, and for other Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. So we need to recognize, surely, that these issues are much more important than who sits on the other side. Who sits on the other side of Mr. Speaker? Who sits in the big chair? Who has the responsibility to carry out, to be responsible for taking Nova Scotians' tax dollars and delivering the programs that we know as a society are best provided for publicly, or are best provided for collectively, Mr. Speaker. And I'm afraid, I'm increasingly, Mr. Speaker, concerned about the fact that if we continue to play these games, we continue to play these phony games about fiscally conservative phony games, Mr. Speaker, that we're only fooling ourselves, and more importantly, that we're disadvantaging many thousands and hundreds of thousands of Nova Scotians and our futures, ultimately, and our futures, and our future as a viable and progressive province. So, Mr. Speaker, those are some of the points that I would like to see us engage in a debate on a debate over this Financial Measures Act. This is the kind of discussion I'd like to see us have, and instead of this phony one about whether we have a surplus or don't have a surplus, Mr. Speaker, because we've got you know, this government has proposed in here a 10% tax cut in January of 2004. It's going to take another $147 million in revenue. $147 million in revenue that's going to go to proportionately to the higher income earners in the province of Nova Scotia. And the people who don't pay taxes will not only not receive any benefit from that income tax cut, but the services that they receive will be further underfunded to the tune of $147 million. So our schools, the special education funding, services for intellectually disabled, Mr. Speaker, aids for the disabled and other Nova Scotians, our roads, our highways, our municipal infrastructure is going to continue to suffer. It's going to continue to suffer until we find better ways to generate revenue that doesn't involve picking the pockets of individual Nova Scotians, which is what this government has done.
Now, member knows that that's unparliamentary, and I ask you to retract that, please.
What's that?
Picking the pockets of Nova Scotia. It is.
Sure, it kind of rolls off your tongue, but if you consider it unparliamentary, Mr. Speaker, then I certainly retract it. And,
Thank you.
And,
the honourable member for Halifax Atlantic has the floor.
Thank you. I've used other terms in the past, things like, you know, sucking like a huge super vacuum out of the pot. But you know what I mean, Mr. Speaker. It's shifting the burden of the costs of these programs from the collective to the individual. And, you know, we've seen this government do that. Over the 4 years since they've been in power, taxes and user fees have increased to the tune of $300 million. $300 million, Mr. Speaker. This government is quickly getting a reputation as being a tax and spend government. The question is, though, what are they spending the money on? Because Nova Scotians are not seeing the benefits. I guess one of the other things that I wanted to say is that this $155. I'm going to come back to this $155, Mr. Speaker, because it does have an impact on a certain segment of the constituency that I represent, Halifax Atlantic, and that is the thousands of people who won't be receiving this tax because they didn't earn enough money last year to file income taxes, Mr. Speaker. And there are over 300,000 such Nova Scotians, over 300,000 Nova Scotians who won't receive the $155. And they won't receive it, Mr. Speaker, because they didn't earn enough money. Because they didn't earn enough money to file an income tax return, Mr. Speaker. So on the one hand, whether it be people that are eligible for the child tax credit, which has been clawed back by this government, whether it's people who have to get their wells tested for water quality themselves, costs of which have risen to over $100 for a basic test, whether it's individuals who are trying to ensure that their child that requires some special assistance in school, that they have to provide extra aid. They have to pay for that cost because it's not provided at school. Mr. Speaker, people that have to pay higher costs for automobile insurance, those people, Mr. Speaker, pay those additional costs, plus they don't get the $155. Plus they're not going to realize the 10% tax cut. So they're getting it both ways. So low and middle income Nova Scotians, I would suggest to you, are getting pounded by this government, are getting just literally pounded by this government, by the double whammy of cuts to services, Mr. Speaker, cuts to programs, and on the other hand, increases in taxes and user fees. This government has not been a friend of the average Nova Scotian. So those are some of the issues, Mr. Speaker, that I would like to have us debate here in this House as we pursue a 6-month hoist on the Financial Measures Act. That we examine these issues, we examine why it is we take in $147 million annually on tobacco taxes. $147 million in tobacco taxes. And yet, we only put back like $2 to $3 million in smoking cessation programs, Mr. Speaker. That we simply do not invest the money into programs that have been proven, that are proven to reduce the number of people who smoke tobacco. You know, why is that, Mr. Speaker? Why is that? There's got to be more to a government than simply taking in money and putting out money. There's got to be some leadership. There's got to be some conscience. There's got to be some balance in terms of what's in the best interest of the people of Nova Scotia. We talked about it here before. I raised it in terms of the Department of Labour and Department of Environment and other departments of this government that have had cutbacks and that are unable to provide the kind of services that they're responsible for because of the cutbacks in staff. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have?
13 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, and you know, a prime example of that is public health. When we see the stories internationally and across the country of the SARS epidemic, you've got to wonder how prepared are we here in the province of Nova Scotia to deal with this problem, to deal with this public health issue. Because, you know, we've cut back on public health as heavily as we've cut back on workplace safety, inspections, Mr. Speaker. We simply do not have the troops on the ground to be able to handle, I believe this, to be able to handle the kind of pressure that is going to be generated if, and let's hope it doesn't happen, but if we are faced with that kind of an epidemic. The West Nile, Mr. Speaker, the West Nile disease is another concern that is out there, and it's not good enough for us to wait until it happens and then respond. We have to be more proactive, we have to be more responsible and progressive in order to ensure that the government, who is responsible for protecting the public interest, is responsible for protecting public health, is able to educate and to work to prevent these kinds of public health issues becoming a serious problem in our economy. And we can only do that, Mr. Speaker, by paying attention to the investments that are necessary, the investments in the programs and services that we provide, rather than simply focusing on an ideologically driven argument about having balanced budgets, ensuring that on a particular accounting book it says that we have more money, we've taken in more money than we have spent, Mr. Speaker, does not reflect the deficits in so many other areas that result in a failure to invest. Schools, healthcare, roads, individual Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, these are all problems that are continuing to build, and unless we get a government that has the confidence and the conviction to make the investments that are necessary, we are going to continue to go down a road where these deficits are going to build, and that does not bode well for the future of the province of Nova Scotia. So with those few comments, I'll resume my place, Mr. Speaker, and indicate that I will be supporting the motion to hoist for 6 months Bill number 36, because I feel that these kinds of issues need to be discussed in the public forum. We need to engage with Nova Scotians over these issues to ensure that the government has the will as well as the support to be able to move in a direction that is much more positive, much more constructive for the people of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and speak on the hoist that was introduced by the NDP caucus on a previous day. Or, I'm sorry, I do apologize. Yes, my colleague from Cape Breton South. The NDP have been so eloquent in some of the arguments that I kind of got caught up in the moment. Not that I'm really captivated by some of the substance all the time, but indeed, in this particular case, I have to agree. Mr. Speaker, some rather interesting developments over the last few days as we watched here in the House last evening. The government passed their budget for all intentional purposes, which they some folks would refer to as a rum bottle budget, by providing that $155 rebate to a certain number of individuals across the province, and indeed, as the government would claim, a 10% tax reduction. Well, there are a number of factors to that, Mr. Speaker, that I believe all Nova Scotians should be aware. Number one, back in the 1999-2000 budget, the Minister of Finance for the province of Nova Scotia, the Honourable Neil LeBlanc, decoupled the taxing process with the federal government, thereby forcing Nova Scotians not to enjoy the benefit of the tax cut that the federal government was providing during that fiscal year and the next fiscal year and the next fiscal year after that. So in effect, what we had, Mr. Speaker, was the provincial government of Nova Scotia gouging the people of Nova Scotia by this decoupling process. There was no tax relief when tax relief should have been provided. That's point number one. Point number two, Mr. Speaker, despite claims by the government on how you define a user fee by any other name is still a tax when it's providing a public service to the people of Nova Scotia. We saw that, Mr. Speaker, with the ambulance fees. We saw that with user fees for licensing fees, for automobiles, for trucks, for ATVs. We saw it for just about anything and everything that the government could possibly tax. Well, Mr. Speaker, that issue generated over $500 million for the provincial government. That's how much more they generate today in revenue than they did when they first came to office. And the Minister of Finance says, good minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe so, maybe not. Let history be the judge of that. Let's look at what's happening today. Let's assume, for the sake of discussion, the Minister of Finance really has a balanced budget. If that's the case, why is the government borrowing $115 million to carry out the programs that it says it has to carry out? Well, you can put on paper all you want that you have a balanced budget and go on to all these amateurized capitalization processes that accountants and chartered accountants and what have you will be able to articulate and say, well, you still have a balanced budget even though you're borrowing more money. Put it all in the mixer together. The fact of the matter is the government does not have a balanced budget. And I would submit any government that has to borrow money to be able to provide a tax break is actually cheating the people of Nova Scotia. They're cheating the people of Nova Scotia by saying, we're going to give you this $155 or we're going to give you that 10% tax break, but because the debt is growing, the interest charges on that debt will increase, which means you're going to have to pay taxes for a longer period of time, whether you like it or not. So really what the Minister of Finance is doing to try and generate and court some favor with the electorate in the province of Nova Scotia is like a deferred maintenance, like what happened with the schools in Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, because of the capital program that was initiated by previous governments, and certainly under the John Buchanan administration, Mr. Speaker, the deferred maintenance grew and grew and grew. And yes, even under the Savage administration, because it had so many other issues to deal with to try and cope with the fact that in some cases, agencies like the Workers' Compensation Board or Nova Scotia Resources Limited, all these agencies, and I can go on about the unfunded liability with the Teachers' Pension Fund, they were all on the verge of bankruptcy. So there were some mistakes made there, but there had to be some value judgments made, which in fact allowed the government to get control of a spiraling out of control situation. So what we have now is a government that would rather take us back in time for the sake of political advantage than it does standing up to the people of Nova Scotia and being as honest and as forthright as it should be. And that's a serious issue. It's not easy to tell people that you can't afford to give them a tax break when they feel that they're being soaked to the bone. Every time they turn around, they're paying higher personal income tax, they're paying higher corporate taxes, they're paying user fees, they're paying higher health care fees. You name it, they're paying it. Now, that's fine if the government wants to kind of embark on a very gradual reduction of tax burden to the people of Nova Scotia. But, Mr. Speaker, that's not what's happening. This is voodoo economics. The Minister of Finance knows this. It's all smoke and mirrors about giving them a tax break while at the same time coming in the back door and gouging over $500 million out of their back pockets. That's something like Merlin. You know, they're saying that they're going to give them this break, which, by the way, they're going to the bank and the banks, and they're borrowing $115 million to say they're giving a $68 million tax break. Now, how can that be good economics, Mr. Speaker? How can that be helping the people of Nova Scotia by increasing their debt load over the long term? Members, not only in that Tory cabinet, but members of the Tory backbenchers, Mr. Speaker, came in with this extreme right-wing fundamentalist view of how everybody had to live within their means. Well, they're not doing it by doing these things. This is cheap theatrical politics to try and win an election. Mr. Speaker, let's look at the reality of the debt. You know, the debt, the servicing charges on the debt have now become the number 2 ticket item in the budget, in the annual budget. When this government came to power, it was 3rd. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, when some elements of this government were in a previous Tory government, the debt burden was down probably about 7th or 8th on the list. It was way down. And now it's 2nd on the list, Mr. Speaker. I'll read the excerpts from the estimates from the public accounts. Mr. Speaker, this year, the debt servicing costs are $1,062,316,000. Now, for the Department of Education, it's $980,241,000. Of course, we know that health is the number 1 expenditure. Health, which is $2.1 billion, more or less. Now, let's go back, Mr. Speaker. Let's go back and look when this government first came to power. This government, who proclaims to have its fiscal house in order and is able to control the growing debt, which, by the way, Mr. Speaker, the Premier said he wouldn't put 1 red cent on the debt. He would not allow the debt to grow by 1 red cent. And here's what it was when they first came to power. Mr. Speaker, education, the budget in 1999 was $1,059,783,000. And the debt servicing cost was $1,041,578,000. So clearly, Mr. Speaker, by the minister's own figures, the debt servicing charges of this province are growing at such a rate they have now taken over the educational costs. And Mr. Speaker, I'll table them. The minister looks confused. I'll table them for him. I'll table them for him. He looks totally confused. And why shouldn't he be? He was part of a government that bankrupted the province on a previous day. He should be confused because we didn't expect any change. Merlin didn't really change. He may have changed his tie. He may have been a little different in time. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the debt is growing and growing and growing. And what do? They go out and borrow $115 million to rebate $68 million and tell the people that they've got a balanced budget. This is voodoo economics, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order, please. Gentleman, Mr. Finance.
Has talked about debt servicing costs have gone up since we've come here, and he's quoted the estimates in the act that was tabled. The member opposite, he's quoting the gross amount. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, if he wants to quote the right amount, he has to show that less the earnings of the sinking funds. The member opposite has been a member of the Executive Council. He would know that. Actually, our debt servicing costs have been relatively constant during our term. And the member, if he wants to speak about facts, then we should put all the facts on the table. I'm not trying to interrupt his speech. However, he should note that, Mr. Chairman.
It's not a point of order, but it's a clarification of facts. Or the honourable member Cape Breton West has the floor.
That's right, Mr. Speaker. The minister is right when he says sinking, because this is what the minister is doing to the province of Nova Scotia. He's sinking us further in debt. And I don't care, Mr. Speaker, how many words that he can use and play games with. I don't care which way you look at it. The bottom line is you're borrowing money to give a tax break. And by borrowing money, you're putting more on the debt. And when you put more on the debt, our interest charges are going to go up. Our credit rating will go down. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. And he can talk about sinking funds. He can talk about floating funds. He can talk about whatever he wants. The bottom line is, Mr. Speaker, they're borrowing money. They borrowed money this year. They borrowed money last year. They borrowed money the year before that. And they borrowed money the year before that. So, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister of Finance to stand in his place and say he has a balanced budget, I don't believe it. He can spin it out all he wants, Mr. Speaker. How can he say he had a balanced budget when he's borrowing money? I mean, how can you say you have a balanced budget in your home, Mr. Speaker, and everything's under control? You're living within your means if you're going with your credit card and borrowing $115 million more. Not that you'd borrow $115 million, because if you had that type of credit rating, you wouldn't have to borrow it. But anyway, I think you get the message. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the minister knows full well that servicing the debt of this province has now become the number 2 ticket item of more than 14 different charges, departmental charges. We have education, we have health, we have natural resources, we have transportation and public works, we have justice, we have environment and labor, we have community services. Mr. Speaker, we have all those. And what's the number 2 ticket item? Servicing the debt. Servicing the debt, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister of Finance can spin it any which way he wants. Because if he was that good, he wouldn't have had to go borrow $115 million this year. Because, according to the government propaganda, they would be living within their means. If you're living within your means, why do you have to go and borrow money from somebody? Why go borrow? You shouldn't have to borrow. And that's the reality, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker?
Order, please. Just want to remind the honourable members the cell phones agreeable would be turned off in the chamber. What? Pardon me? The honourable member Cape Breton West.
No, Mr. Speaker. I think that some of the government members are probably so excited about my speech that they're calling their constituents to turn on their TV and listen. That's what it's all about, see? They know, Mr. Speaker, that the debt is growing, and they should get the message out and don't listen to the Premier and the Minister of Finance. That's really what's happening. They're really coming to their senses that going and borrowing $115 million to give a tax break is not good economics. Because you're not doing any good. In the short, it's short-term gain, long-term pain. I don't know if they've ever heard that saying. Mr. Speaker, the minister is saying they borrowed more than that. So they borrow 118 million, not 115. And I do thank the Minister of Finance for acknowledging that they are borrowing more money. I do appreciate that. So we're worse off than even I thought we were, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just to give you an example of the skepticism that's pervasive across Nova Scotia, let's go back and just recall some of the activities that took place before some of the committees of this House. Public Accounts, several weeks ago, the Deputy Minister came before Public Accounts, and he confirmed, Mr. Speaker, he confirmed that the Capital School construction program was before Cabinet. Now that was on Wednesday, April 16th, 2003, and it's on page 16 of Hansard. So that's public document, so I won't have to bother with that. And the Deputy Minister indicated that he couldn't tell the people of Nova Scotia what schools were on the priority list, what schools were being considered. That's an issue that's before Cabinet. Now, whether we agree or whether we don't agree, I respect what the Deputy Minister said. Now, Mr. Speaker, let's fast forward to during the estimates, when I asked the Minister of Education on this very issue. He said, again, this was an issue that was being considered by Cabinet, and that's not something you discuss. Any Cabinet documents or recommendations, what we call R&R, report and recommendations, are not public documents until the final decision of Cabinet is made. Okay, I respect that. I have full confidence that the Minister is within the terms of reference and the process of government and Cabinet confidentiality. Well, Mr. Speaker, you may or may not recall, during those committee estimates, when the member for the Eastern Shore was chairing the committee, I got a little impatient with the Minister of Education and suggested that perhaps he was misleading the committee intentionally. Now, rather than have complete polarization, I thought the best way to diffuse it is I would exit the chamber and let sleeping dogs sleep and let things cool down a bit. Well, Mr. Speaker, I received in my mail this afternoon a document from the Department of Education, which, by the way, Mr. Speaker, is entitled Memorandum, and I will table it for members of the committee or members of the House. It's from Charles Clattenburg, dated April 24th, 2003, and the subject, I quote, Report of the School Capital Construction Committee, December 2000. Well, Mr. Speaker, this is when Cabinet met. This is when Cabinet met to decide this issue. Cabinet met, Executive Council, at its meeting held March 27, 2003, considered the enclosed memorandum submitted by the Department of Education in June 2001, recommending that, and it recommends two general issues. But here's the most interesting part, Mr. Speaker. Here's the most interesting part about this document, and I quote, "This will confirm that the Minister of Education requested that this item be withdrawn from the Cabinet agenda. If you require anything further, please contact me." Well, Mr. Speaker, clearly, either there's another document floating around, or the Minister of Education has been deliberately misleading this committee and this House, or staff within his department are aware of one agenda and he's aware of another agenda. Mr. Speaker, maybe when I'm finished with this, I'll table it. Okay. So, Mr. Speaker, why is it that the Minister will say during his budget estimates that the document is before Cabinet? His Deputy Minister, only a week or so before that, said it was before Cabinet, and yet, by Mr. Clattenburg's signature in this document, it's not before Cabinet. Who's telling the truth? Who's right and who's wrong? Is Mr. Clattenburg, who, by the way, is the Director of Facilities Management, is he that ill-informed? Is he that ill-advised about what's happening at the political level? Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Clattenburg was in attendance, as I recall, with the Deputy Minister. And there was an excellent opportunity So any which way you look at it, somebody has not been forthright with this House and anyone that's been before the committee during estimates. Because, Mr. Speaker, I will table this, because the decision was made on March 27 to withdraw that from Cabinet, that very issue. Now, if it was withdrawn from Cabinet, how can they say it's still before Cabinet? You wonder why we're suspect. You wonder why we're suspect of what's going on within government circles. And, Mr. Speaker, it would be well advised for some of the Tory backbenchers, as well as Cabinet colleagues, to read that document. It'd be very interesting to see what the priority listings are. You know, I noticed last year in the local media, well, it would be almost 2 years now, Mr. Speaker, year and a half. The member for Cape Breton North, who is now the Minister of Economic Development, indicated that the number one priority in his area for the school board was a school in North Sydney. And the Cape Breton Victoria District School Board officials come out and says, that's not even our priority.